I'd like to welcome Isaac Henderson, Dr. Isaac Henderson. He's a lecturer at Massey University, a senior lecturer actually in aviation. He's also the chair of UAVNZ, and he's going to be giving us a talk today on rationalising UAV operations. So are you there, Isaac?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
And you can see my screen?
Not quite. I just need to go to the chat function. Yes, yeah, we've got your presentation. We can see you and we can hear you. So over to you, Isaac. Thank you very much.
That's great, awesome. Thank you very much, Robin. I only caught the last parts of your presentation, but it's certainly good to be here. Coming from I guess, a different perspective. I'm not a forestry scientist. Forestry is not my field of expertise, but I am an expert in aviation, and what interests me is how we operate, how we regulate different types of aviation technologies. And one of my specialties are uncrewed aircraft. You might use other terms like drones or the like, but really that's sort of where my interest lies. And I have worked with Robin recently on a paper that is very focused on forestry, but providing that aviation lens. And that's what I hope to do today. And I will wear both hats as chair of UAVNZ, which is an industry and professional body for commercial and professional uncrewed aircraft operators, but also as a lecturer at Massey University School of Aviation, and sort of taking things from an evidence-based point of view as well, because the two align quite well. So first I want to begin with the ideal UAV operator, and this is sort of, you know, it goes across any sector. So the ideal UAV operator is someone who has the right knowledge imparted from the right training, that has the right skills gained through experience, and someone who has the right attitudes so that they apply their knowledge and their skills in a professional manner. And so whenever we think about pilot training in crewed aviation, we always talk about the necessary knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And the same is very applicable when we think about a UAV operator. Now, the issue that I think I see in forestry, and it's certainly not alone in this regard, the main one is that most of the operations are what you would call semi-professional. So you don't have a lot of people where their full-time job is operating an uncrewed aircraft. Most people are a forestry scientist. You know, they work for a forestry company in some capacity. They might be a scientific researcher, and all they're doing is using that uncrewed aircraft as part of their wider responsibilities. So it's not sort of the core of their focus. It's just a very useful tool for what their main job is. And there are parallels with that in a number of sectors, and probably the vast majority of uncrewed aircraft operations are semi-professional. The second issue is that sometimes uncrewed aircraft may be perceived as toys. You know, they're just something to have a bit of fun with. And sometimes their operators don't see themselves as aviation participants. And so, you know, we really need to change that mindset so that people understand that they are participants within a wider aviation sector. UAVNZ is quite unique in that regard. We're actually a division of Aviation New Zealand, and I sit on the board of Aviation New Zealand, which represents the wider commercial aviation sector. So we very much see ourselves as part of a wider aviation community. The other thing in forestry, and also in most cases in agriculture as well, your ground risk is typically quite low, because most plantations and you know, national parks, whatever it might be, tend to be in fairly remote areas. But just because the ground is low risk, it doesn't mean that the air is low risk. You could have substantial airborne risk. And that's because, you know, most people think of airspace as like this blue void that exists above them. But actually, there are different classifications of airspace. There are different things you can do in different types of airspace. It's far more complex than what people might think. So you might be in a remote area, but it's also, for example, a low fly zone, and flying school flies aircraft very low in that particular area. They can go down below 400 feet in those areas to practice low level flying. In that case, yes, your ground risk is not much because there's no one around in this remote area, but there might be an aircraft at a low altitude. So we have to consider both ground and airborne risk. Now, if you want to think of yourself as an aviation participant, one of the key things is you have to pivot away from what we're used to dealing with in most sectors, which is the Health and Safety in the Workplace Act. The relevant health and safety legislation is now the Civil Aviation Act of 1990, which gives power to the civil aviation rules. And they're the primary thing you would be interacting with in terms of compliance. Now, there is an MOU that exists there that defines the scope of each jurisdiction of each agency there. So the Civil Aviation Authority is the relevant authority from when you start pre-flighting your aircraft until it's packed up. Now, anything outside of that is WorkSafe. And if it's a generalized risk, then it can also become WorkSafe. So you might be familiar with the White Island case. The reason why that moved on to WorkSafe is a volcanic hazard is a general hazard. It's not an aviation specific one. And that's why it got moved on even for, you know, helicopter operators and the like. But strictly speaking, UAVs are aircraft. And that's also being made much more explicit in the Civil Aviation Bill, which is now at its second reading before Parliament. So, you know, you are flying an aircraft, you are flying in airspace, you are an aviation participant, legally speaking, as soon as you start pre-flighting your uncrewed aircraft. And I'm just going to bring up the two civil aviation rules, which I think are the most widely misunderstood, probably aren't complied with, or at least many operators wouldn't be able to prove that they're complying with them. Now, these are taken from the Part 101 of the Civil Aviation Rules. And some people might go, well, what if you've got a 102 certificate, which allows you to go beyond those? But these are two rules which you cannot vary under a Part 102 certificate. In fact, a 102 operator's manual will have a lot of documentation to show how they comply with these requirements. But for those who aren't going to that extent, you can do everything you want to under the Part 101 rules, the sort of general operating rules. You know, here's what's relevant. And these are normally the ones where Part 101 operators are non-compliant. So Civil Aviation Rule 101.12b says that any person whom this rule applies, so that's any uncrewed aircraft operator, must ensure that before each flight, the person is aware of the airspace designation under Part 71 and any applicable airspace restrictions in place in the area of intended operation. Or the second part of that is you could have someone else who's present who does that part for you. So you could be operating the uncrewed aircraft. You didn't check the airspace designation or any restrictions, but you had someone who was able to do that and competent at doing that who did that for you. The other one is 101.13, which simply says a person operating any of the following, and you can see uncrewed aircrafts on the list, must take all practicable steps to minimise hazards to persons, property and other aircraft. Now, the big issue is how do you show that you are in compliance with those two steps if you don't have organisational processes in place to do so? If you haven't got anything in place, then how do we know it's happening? And so some of these high level things about what we can do to make operations, particularly in forestry, more professional, well, let's look at some research, and I am blowing my own trumpet a bit here, but this is an article I published earlier this year looking at what operational risk mitigations uncrewed aircraft users applied before their flights. And when you think about the two rules we've looked at, so do they log their flight on AirShare, which is this tool provided by Airways that shows a number of different types of airspace? It's not a complete tool though. Ideally, people should be looking at visual navigation charts, which actually detail the full airspace information around the area. Notices to airmen, or NOTAMs, which give you temporary changes or notifications about airspace. Job safety assessment, so you're actually considering all your ground-based and airborne risks where you're operating. Pre-flight checks, this one's not really relevant, but company procedures, Part 102 procedures. And you take a look, so people are pretty good at doing a pre-flight check, but outside of that, we've got less than a quarter of operators that do, particularly I'd highlight these 4 things: checking visual navigation charts, checking NOTAMs, conducting a job safety assessment. But the interesting thing is, if you look at differences between groups of users, those who are doing professional or semi-professional operations fare better. Those who have done a theory course fare better. Those who are members of UAVNZ fare better, and those who are Part 102 operators fare better. But the particularly relevant ones there are around professionalism, education, and being a member of a professional body. That improves the likelihood of applying those risk mitigations. So, you know, if you're feeling like maybe your organization or you as a user aren't doing these, don't worry. Less than a quarter of users are, but these are probably the 3 most effective risk mitigations that should be applied before each flight, and indeed will be, I imagine, covered at some point with some of the tools for Forrester's framework. So that first bit is around training and competency. That seems to have the biggest effect on how many risk mitigations are put in place by an operator prior to their operation. And so the questions you should be asking yourself as an organization are, do your pilots know how to read a visual navigation chart and check AIP SUP? So those are supplements to the Aeronautical Information publication. And can they read NOTAMs and check NOTAMs? Because if they can't, then they can't actually comply with Civil Aviation Rule 101.12b, because they can't check the airspace designation under Part 71. So you've got no way of being compliant with that rule. Have they been assessed as competent pilots in manual reversion modes? Now, I add that because sometimes pilots only get to fly in what we call GNS modes or GPS modes. So they're using basically the aircraft through a GNS system will position itself and keep that position. But the trouble is, if that fails, and that's a relatively common failure, and let's say it's a windy day, and you can't manually fly it, then you're going to blow away and you have an accident. And overseas, there's been a number of accident reports where that was the key issue, was pilots were not competent to fly in a manual reversion mode. So that's something you actually want to assess against, not just have they got enough hours flying this thing, but have they also proven competency in a manual reversion mode. And the other group of people that get fit in are visual observers, but how do you prove that they're trained and competent as well if they're partaking in an operation? How do they know how to visually scan airspace? How do they know standard phraseologies for talking to the pilot? So there's a number of areas there in training and competency that are important, but we'll probably focus a bit more on the first 2 here because it's primarily pilots that play the biggest role here. And one of the things which I would encourage, tools for Forrester's members to do is use a UAVNZ recognised training provider. Now, this is a scheme that we worked on earlier this year, and it's only recently sort of been released, but we have a set of professional standards that outline a graduate profile, the profile for instructors and examiners, a peer review process, and also a way of making complaints against these training providers to help better regulate the sector. because some training providers, they don't cover the full spectrum. They only teach, say, air share, not visual navigation charts, which are actually really critical. Or perhaps their flight examination is allowed to be conducted in GNS mode, in which case you're not getting any assessment as to whether they can fly in a manual reversion mode. And while this scheme is open to any training provider to sign up to, the ones who have signed up to it this year are here. There's 5, Massey University School of Aviation, ASMS, RPA Skills, Fly UAV, and Drones Up. So I'd encourage use of one of these training providers, and if there are any issues with them, you can also get recourse by making a complaint under the UAVNZ code. So there's also a recourse option. The other thing which we're working on at the moment is a pilot accreditation. So this is not finalised, and this is something I'd like to discuss more with Tools for Foresters to see if this is going to be of interest to your members. But we are setting standards for training and for operational experience. We're probably going to have 3 tiers of accreditation, and we're writing a professional code for UAV pilots. And we're working with Aspect to assess whether pilots can apply that code to realistic operational scenarios. So people may not have heard of Aspect, but they do all of the theory tests for the Civil Aviation Authority in New Zealand, as well as a number of other regulators around the world. But they also work with professional bodies around the world, including the Institute of Directors here in New Zealand, where they have those sorts of scenario-based questions where you can see whether, in that case, a director of a company can apply the codes for the Institute of Directors to those situations. We're looking at doing something similar so we can actually assess professionalism. And that would give some reputational benefit to the pilots. We're also working with councils, Department of Conservation, entities like that about whether those with a certain accreditation might get easier landowner permissions under Part 101. And we're also working with a particular insurer who will be looking to give either discounted premiums and or zero excess claims for organisations that use this accreditation scheme. So that's something we're working on, and I'll be discussing more with Robin and the team at Tools for Foresters to see whether that's going to be something that might be helpful. So is that not going? There we go. So then if we move beyond that training and competency piece, we also had that hazard and risk minimisation rule there in 101.13. And so some of the things that you're going to have to think about as an organisation, well, first of all, job safety assessments. And this is something I know Tools for Foresters has been working on. These are one of the best ways you can mitigate risk, because they force you to think about the ground-based and the airborne risk. You might sketch out the area you're operating in. You might have some things you have to check off. You might have to assign roles if there's more people involved. And so it's a way of formally assessing the hazards and the risks. Because if you have that and you keep a copy of it, and let's say there was an accident, that is at least a form of evidence that you were complying with that rule. If you had no process and you had an accident, you can imagine the Civil Aviation Authority and or WorkSafe going, well, why didn't you have a process? Why was this none? And they might argue that that's negligence. And of course, that has serious reputational implications, but also potentially legal ones. And there should be checklists. So how do you get ready for a flight? And when I talk about pre-flight, I don't just mean the airworthiness of the aircraft, but also just the various activities you have to do before you would take off and do an operation. You want your in-flight checklists, post-flight checklists, and also emergency checklists. Because when an emergency happens, you don't want to have to go, oh, wow, what do I do now? You want it to be thought out and go, right, here's how we'd respond to this. And I guess for in forestry in particular, the risk of a post-crash fire is probably one of your biggest risks. So you'd want to have a checklist for, if there's an accident that managed the potential for a post-crash fire. You'd want to have processes of flight briefings in multi-crew operations. So if you've got more than one pilot, or you've got a pilot and some visual observers, you actually want to explain what each person's role is, what they're going to be doing, how you communicate with one another so that those operations actually work effectively. You want to have processes to make sure your aircraft is maintained and airworthy. Even very small aircraft, you should be replacing, for example, props every 200, 300 flights, batteries every 200, 300 charges, things like that to make sure that they're airworthy. You want standard operating procedures for your sort of normal sorts of operations that take into account particularly the airspace you might be operating in. And then there's all these human factors considerations, which sometimes also get forgotten, like fatigue. You can't have your pilots operating, for example, 10 hours a day, 7 days in a row, because the potential for fatigue to create more errors is too great. Drugs and alcohol policies, in the civil aviation rules, the pilot has to have a BAC of 0 and cannot be under the influence of alcohol. So if someone's hungover or someone has a positive breath alcohol, you're non-compliant in that sense. But you also want stand-down periods like the bottle to throttle rule that's applied. There's potential for visual illusions, and you want to make sure people are aware of those. You have things around human information processing. So when you write checklists, how are they formatted? What do they look like? What sorts of words and terminologies should you be using to make sure that that will be understood and carried out in a standard manner by all people? And then there's many others. And so you can see, an organization can build up quite a repository of things it might need to consider. And so going forward, where I see some collaboration between UAVNZ and Tools for Foresters, I mean, firstly, we would like to endorse what Tools for Foresters is trying to achieve by actually working collectively across your sector to provide resources to professionalise. We see that as really a very positive step. I would encourage any organisation that conducts UAV operations in a commercial or a professional capacity to join UAVNZ as well. Membership is not mutually exclusive, but there are different focuses for each organisation. And we commit to continuing to work with Tools for Foresters to ensure that the objectives of both organisations are being met. We want to professionalise uncrewed aircraft operations across the country, and we see Tools for Foresters as being a really key stakeholder in that by representing such a large sector. And just a bit on that, in case of interest, it's actually very cheap. It's $253 for an organisation to join, $126.50 for an individual. You sign a code of conduct which outlines your member expectations in line with our values of safety, quality, sustainability, collaboration and education, but it also provides mechanisms for alleging breaches of the code against member organisations, for those being investigated, and also how we would respond to those breaches. And having presided over 2 investigations, neither resulted in the member being kicked out, but they resulted in very useful recommendations for that member to implement to remain within the fold and to actually improve their operations. But it gives a mechanism of recourse again, which provides some reputational benefit. The other thing is you get access to our resources, and starting in the new year, we will have an executive officer as a dedicated resource to UAVNZ, which will be available, and that could be of great benefit to a number of the organisations and Tools for Foresters. And if you do join as a member, we will give you an endorsement. This has only just been announced at our conference 2 days ago, so you won't see this widely yet, but making sure that there's something to differentiate organisations and show that they're adhering to some standard. So to finalise, even the most basic aircraft can be operated in a professional manner, and that's really about having the right attitudes. But while professionalism is an attitude, you do actually need to back that up with tangible organisational policies and resources, and I've covered some of those ones, and I know Tools for Foresters are working on building a lot of those resources as well, and we will be glad to assist as UAVNZ. And while I did highlight some areas of compliance, there is a difference between legal minima, where if you break it, you end up in jail or fined or the like, and best practice. And while the government gets to determine what the legal minima are, industry gets to determine the other. And that's where I see organisations like Tools for Foresters and UAVNZ as playing a very critical role. So look, that's my presentation for you all. Hopefully that's been useful. I'm not sure if we have any time left, but if we do, I'm quite happy to take any questions.
So we weren't flash enough to get the old text questions sorted out for this one. So if anyone has any questions, raise their hands and I'll run around with the microphone with the old fashioned way. Questions to Isaac. I will say at this point as well, anyone who asks a question today gets a free t-shirt. So
Oh, no, oldies the professor. Oh, yeah.
he has a very good skincare regime. Let's just say that. And that's a t-shirt. Any other questions? In that case, Isaac. Oh.
Thank you very much. I'll leave you all to it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I think we might have a question here.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Is this linked up to, is the Tools for Foresters linked into NZIU and the professionalism of the industry? And I guess it's just more a comment to the speaker about that opportunity for certified professional and registered professional foresters to be accredited and linked up with this particular body.
From a Tools for Foresters perspective, not yet. That's actually something we haven't considered. So that's a really good point. Isaac, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, we don't have that link right now, but we're quite happy to work with any other professional bodies where that's appropriate, and it certainly might be for an organisation like the Institute for Foresters. But the I guess our focus is very clearly just on UAV operations and the support services for that in a commercial or a professional manner. And so we're very focused on one aspect, but we're happy to work with other organisations that look at it more broadly. And so, in forestry, where this is a very growing area, it makes sense to say, well, we're not going to tell you how to be a professional forester, but we can tell you how to be a professional UAV operator, and that's useful for forestry. So, I mean, anyone who wants to link up on that, I'm sure Robin can provide you my contacts, and I'd be very happy to discuss that further.
No problem. I've got a question over here, sir. T-shirt for Lania as well, please.
Thanks. My question is, when will you start to integrate drone or UAV training into poles? So foresters are using it, ags are using it. When will it start to become like a first aid certificate? And how long will it take to catch up?
Well, there is already training available. The trouble is that Part 101 of the Civil Aviation Rules is an open part of the system. Your only barrier to entry is whether you can afford the aircraft or not. So, I mean, if you've got a credit card and you can drive to Noel Leeming, then you can, be part of the system. And so I think really the way that the country should go is some form of licensing system, not making it particularly onerous, but actually, if you want to do operations outside of quite confined bounds, that there is a defined set of training and assessment that is required, and that would make it a much more standardized process. UAVNZ's advocated for that for a few years, but unfortunately the Civil Aviation Authority and the Ministry of Transport don't want to go down that line, and so we're stuck with the system we have. But that's sort of what we're trying to do with our professional standards for training organisations, is to standardise the training that's on offer and to provide some sort of recognised standard, so that for an organisation that wants to manage its risk, that they can say, yes, we're adhering to this standard, and that should be that counts for something. So, again, there's no legal minima, there's no sort of set thing you can do. There are standard courses that you can do by approved organisations, but all you get is a certificate at the end of it. So, and it's a bit more expensive and it takes a bit longer than a first aid certificate. They're 3-day courses at the moment, but beyond that, there's not really much on offer, and that's a real shame and something which I think needs to be addressed in the near future.
Thank you, sir. T-shirt for this gentleman as well. Yeah.
Just a quick question. What are your do you know what your counterparts over in Australia are doing, and are they obviously on the same path as what has been developed in New Zealand today?
Yeah, so Australia, in terms of their regulatory framework, is much further along the track than New Zealand. So they do actually have some general operating rules. They have licensing, and then they go up to operator certification only for quite complex operations. And they also have a lot of standard scenarios to allow things like beyond visual line of sight, which is quite difficult to be able to do here. So, but in terms of their body, the Australian Association for Uncrewed Systems, we are actually working together at the moment to see where we can collaborate. So, for example, our pilot accreditation program, we're looking at, is that going to be a UAVNZ thing, or could we make an Australasian standard? Because we're not dealing with legal requirements. We're a professional body. We're making our own requirements and saying this is what we think the standard should be, and it's voluntary as to whether an organisation wants to join in and adhere to it or not. But certainly we're trying to collaborate more. Unfortunately, because we have very different regulatory frameworks, we can't collaborate on everything, and our areas of advocacy end up being quite different to theirs, where that they have a much more progressive regulatory system. So yeah, but we try to work together as much as possible.
Is there any guidance being developed around privacy issues where imagery may be captured of individuals or private property during operations?
Yes, so the Privacy Commission has said a number of years ago now that unmanned aircraft with cameras on board have to comply with the same sorts of rules as for CCTV cameras, and they have to comply with the principles of the Privacy Act. But the most simple way I would put it for guidance, I mean, you can read a manual like that, but the most simple thing you can refer to is, are you recording video where there is a reasonable expectation of privacy? Because that's where you're going to get in trouble. And the example I give is, my front lawn is not fenced off. So if someone went past in a car or anything else with a camera and they recorded me standing in my front lawn, they're not actually breaking any particular rules with that. But in my backyard, which is fully fenced off, and I have a reasonable expectation of privacy, if someone's capturing video footage, that could breach that. But that also depends on how that's stored and how it's used. And so sometimes where you, for example, remote sensing, where you might inadvertently capture some information, if you're storing that and using it in a way that preserves privacy, you may still be compliant with that. But that is a more of an area for the Privacy Commission and the area of jurisdiction, but it's certainly an area which UAVNZ wants to release some more guidance around and work with the Privacy Commission to make sure that there's some more specific things. They were talking at our conference 2 days ago, so that's quite good, and we're going to keep that link going to make that much clearer. So yes, but it is a relevant piece of legislation, and it is also part of professionalism as adhering to the Privacy Act. Luckily in forestry, you're unlikely to come up against it. It's a bigger concern in urban environments.
Oh, any more questions? One at the back. Bear with me.
Don't get out in the field much these days.
You mentioned the civil aviation bill that's going through in its second reading in Parliament. So if this all goes through, what changes does that mean for us? Or is there anything that will affect us?
It won't change the civil aviation rules, because all the Act does is it gives the power to the Civil Aviation Authority, the Minister of Transport and the Director of Civil Aviation to make rules, and that doesn't change in the new Act. What it does do is it gives police some new powers to seize and detain uncrewed aircraft and things like that. We're a little bit concerned about that because I don't think frontline police officers have any idea about the civil aviation rules, but we're working on that with the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee, and we've made submissions about that. But probably it won't change anything for your operations. The only thing that's really positive from it for anyone in the room there that might be a bit frustrated with the Civil Aviation Authority's reluctance to approve certain types of operations, even when they've been applied for in a very risk-based manner, is there will be a procedure for an independent review of a decision by the Civil Aviation Authority. And we're hoping that that might provide the means for greater amounts of beyond visual line of sight operations and things like that, where there are acceptable standards that have been shown to be met and would be acceptable in other countries, like for example Australia, but are not being allowed here. So it shouldn't change much on the day-to-day operations, but it might provide, particularly that independent review mechanism, ways to have a bit more of a check and balance on the Civil Aviation Authority, and potentially get through operations which are not really readily available right now. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Any more questions? In that case, I think we've got Andrew online, so I'll just say a massive thank you to Isaac for speaking today, and a round of applause for Isaac as well.
Thank you very much, Robin, and to Tools for Foresters for hosting me. It was a pleasure talking to you all, and please do keep in touch. If you want to get in touch, Robin will happily provide you my email and phone number.
Thanks very much.